The cave was supposed to be a secret, a hiding place, a gift from a father to a son who needed magic in his life after losing too much too young. Henry Dalton found it in June, while searching for a stray calf that had wandered into the ravine behind their small ranch. The calf was nowhere to be found, but the cave was there, a dark opening in the limestone cliff, half hidden by wild roses that had grown thick across the rocky slope. He almost walked past it. Almost. But something made him stop, push through the thorny bushes, and step into the cool darkness beyond. What he found made him catch his breath. The cave was perfect. Not too large, not too small, perhaps 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand, and a floor of smooth sand that generations of flooding had deposited and smoothed. Light filtered in through the entrance, softened by the rose bushes into something gentle and golden. The air was cool but not cold, fresh but not drafty, and in that moment, standing alone in the secret space, Henry Dalton knew exactly what he was going to do with it. His son James was 8 years old and hadn't smiled since his mother died. Catherine Dalton had been dead for 14 months, taken by a fever that swept through the territory in the spring of 1885. She had been sick for only 3 days, laughing on Monday, bedridden on Tuesday, gone by Thursday morning. Henry had held her hand at the end, had felt the exact moment when her grip loosened and her spirit departed, had watched the light leave eyes that had been his home for 12 years. James had been 7 then, old enough to understand death, but too young to process it. He had stopped speaking for 2 weeks after the funeral, and when words finally returned, the boy behind them was different, quieter, sadder, older in ways that no child should be. Henry had tried everything. New toys, new books, trips to town, visits from cousins. Nothing worked. James went through the motions of childhood without experiencing any of its joy. He did his chores, ate his meals, said his prayers, and retreated into a silence that Henry couldn't penetrate. The ranch work helped Henry survive his own grief. Physical exhaustion left no energy for dwelling on loss. But James had no such outlet. He was too young for heavy labor, too old for the innocent play that might have distracted him. He existed in a terrible middle ground, aware of what he had lost, but unable to do anything about it. The cave changed everything. Henry began work on the secret bedroom the day after he discovered the cave, stealing hours from his ranch duties whenever he could manage it without raising James's suspicion. The project gave him purpose beyond mere survival. Every board he carried up the ravine, every nail he hammered into place, every small improvement he made to the hidden space, all of it was for James. All of it was love translated into action, grief transformed into creation. He worked in the early mornings before James woke, and in the evenings after the boy had gone to bed. He invented excuses for his absences, checking fence lines, searching for strays, meeting with neighbors about shared concerns. The deception weighed on him, but he told himself it was temporary, that the reveal would justify the secrecy. The physical labor was its own kind of therapy. When he was hauling lumber up the ravine, his mind couldn't wander to Catherine's empty side of the bed. When he was measuring and cutting and fitting boards together, he couldn't dwell on the sound of her laugh that he was already beginning to forget. The work filled the spaces that grief had hollowed out, gave his hands something to do besides hang uselessly at his sides. He made mistakes, of course. The first floor he laid was uneven, and he had to pull it up and start again. The walls took 3 attempts before he figured out how to brace them properly against the curved cave surface. The ceiling leaked the first time it rained, sending water dripping onto the bed until Henry sealed every gap with pine pitch. Each mistake taught him something. Each correction made the bedroom better. By the time he finished, The space was truly professional. Something Catherine would have been proud of. Something that showed the craftsmanship she had always admired in him. He started with the basics. A wooden floor laid over the sand, raised slightly on supports to keep moisture from seeping through. Walls of rough-cut lumber to define the sleeping area and provide surfaces for hanging things. A ceiling of canvas stretched tight to catch any water that might drip from the rock above. Then came the details that would make it magical. A bed frame built from pine, with a mattress stuffed with dried grass and wool that Henry had carted himself. A small table beside the bed, with a drawer for treasures. Shelves along one wall, waiting to be filled with books and curiosities. A chest at the foot of the bed for clothes and blankets. He hung a lantern from a hook in the ceiling, positioned so its light would fill the space with warm, golden glow. He brought in a thick rug that had belonged to Catherine, one she had made during the first year of their marriage. He placed her photograph on the bedside table, where James could see her face first thing upon waking. The final touch was a wooden sign, carved during long evenings when James was asleep. It read, "James's secret hideout. No grown-ups allowed, except by invitation." He hung it above the entrance, invisible from outside but unmistakable from within. The bedroom was finished by late August, just as the summer heat began to fade and the first hints of autumn crept into the mountain air. Henry had spent nearly 3 months on the project, working in stolen moments, keeping the secret even when his exhaustion made him want to confess everything. Now came the hardest part, showing James. "I found something," Henry said one Saturday morning in early September. "Something I want to show you." James looked up from his breakfast with the flat expression that had become his default. "What kind of something?" "A secret. But you have to promise not to tell anyone. This is just for us." A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, crossed the boy's face. "I promise." They walked together up the ravine, Henry's heart pounding with anticipation and fear. What if James didn't like it? What if the gesture seemed foolish, a grown man building a playhouse for a child who had already left childhood behind? What if all those hours of work meant nothing? The wild roses were blooming their second round of the season, filling the air with sweetness that reminded Henry painfully of Catherine. She had loved roses, had planted them around their cabin, had worn their scent like perfume. "Through here," Henry said, pushing aside the thorny branches to reveal the cave entrance. "Watch your step." James ducked through the gap, Henry following close behind. The boy stopped just inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. The bedroom. The bed with its handmade frame and thick mattress. The rug his mother had woven. The photograph on the nightstand. The shelves waiting for his treasures. The sign above the entrance declaring this space his own. "Papa?" James's voice was barely a whisper. "What is this?" "It's yours," Henry said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Your secret place. Somewhere you can come when you need to be alone, or when you want to read, or when you just need somewhere that's yours and nobody else's." James walked slowly into the room, his hand trailing along the wooden wall, his eyes moving from detail to detail. He sat on the bed, testing its softness. He opened the drawer of the nightstand, finding it empty but waiting. He looked at his mother's photograph for a long moment. "Mama's rug," he said quietly. "She would have wanted you to have it. She would have wanted you to have a place that was special, just for you." James was silent for so long that Henry began to fear he had made a terrible mistake. But then the boy looked up, and there were tears on his cheeks. The first tears he had shed since the funeral, the first crack in the armor he had built around his grief. "Thank you, Papa," James said. "Thank you." Henry sat beside his son on the bed, and they held each other in the cool quiet of the cave, crying together for the first time since Catherine died. The tears washed something clean between them, opened a door that grief had sealed shut. When they finally walked back to the cabin, James was holding his father's hand. He hadn't done that in over a year. The secret bedroom became James's sanctuary through the autumn months. He went there after school, spending hours reading books by lantern light, or simply lying on the bed watching shadows move across the cave ceiling. He brought treasures to fill the shelves, interesting rocks, abandoned bird nests, a collection of arrowheads he found in the fields. He talked to his mother's photograph, telling her about his days, asking questions that would never be answered. Henry saw the change immediately. The flat expression began to soften. Words came more easily. Small smiles appeared, rare at first, but gradually more frequent. The boy who had been frozen in grief was slowly thawing. "I told Mama about the arithmetic test," James reported one evening at dinner. "She always helped me with arithmetic. I think she would have been proud that I got all the answers right." "She would have been very proud," Henry agreed, his heart aching with love and loss and gratitude all mixed together. "I told her about the new calf, too, the one with the white spot on its forehead. I named it Star. Mama liked stars." She did. She used to count them when she couldn't sleep. The conversations about Catherine became regular occurrences, natural and healing rather than painful. James was processing his grief in the only way he knew how, by keeping his mother present, by talking to her even though she couldn't answer. The cave bedroom had given him a space to do that privately, without worrying about his father's reaction. Henry sometimes wondered if he should join these conversations, should share his own grief more openly. But he sensed that James needed this to be his alone, needed the independence of processing his feelings without a parent watching. The gift of the cave was also a gift of privacy, of autonomy, of trust. By November, James was almost like the boy he had been before. Not the same, never exactly the same, but alive again in ways that mattered. He laughed at jokes, he played with the ranch dogs, he looked forward to things instead of dreading everything. The cave bedroom had worked exactly as Henry had hoped. And then the blizzard came. The Great Blizzard of 1886 announced itself on January 9th with a drop in barometric pressure so sudden that animals all across the territory went mad with anxiety. Henry had lived in Montana long enough to read the signs. The taste of the air, metallic and heavy. The way sound carried differently, muffled and strange. The behavior of the cattle, huddling together and refusing to graze despite the mild temperature of that deceptive morning. "Storm coming," he told James as they ate breakfast. "A bad one. We need to prepare." They spent the morning hauling firewood onto the cabin's covered porch, filling every bucket and barrel with water, bringing the chickens into the small shed attached to the cabin's north wall. The cattle would have to fend for themselves. There was no way to shelter the whole herd, but Henry drove them into the ravine where the terrain would offer some protection from the wind. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple-gray clouds rolling in from the north with visible speed. The temperature began to drop, 5 degrees an hour, then 10, then 15. The mild morning became a bitter afternoon, and the afternoon promised a deadly night. "Papa," James said as they finished their preparations, "what about my cave?" Henry looked at his son, seeing the worry in his eyes. The secret bedroom wasn't just a room to James anymore. It was a connection to his mother, a sanctuary, a piece of his healing. The thought of it being destroyed by the storm was clearly painful. "The cave will be fine," Henry assured him. "Caves have survived thousands of storms. The rock protects everything inside." But even as he said it, a different thought was forming in his mind. The cave would be fine, more than fine. The cave would be warm. Underground spaces maintained constant temperatures, buffered from the extremes that killed people and livestock on the surface. The cave bedroom, buried in the hillside, would be perhaps 50 degrees regardless of what happened outside. Compared to the cabin, with its drafty walls and insufficient heating, the cave might actually be safer. "James," Henry said slowly, "I want you to gather some things. Blankets, food, the big lantern. Enough for a few days." "Why?" "Because we might need to use your secret hideout for more than just reading." They made the trip to the cave at 3 in the afternoon, just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Henry carried a pack loaded with supplies: dried meat, hardtack, a pot for melting snow into water, extra candles, matches, blankets. James carried a smaller pack with his own essentials: his favorite book, a change of clothes, the carved wooden horse that had been his mother's last gift to him. The walk up the ravine was eerie, the air thick with the electricity of the approaching storm. The temperature had dropped to nearly 0 already, and the wind was beginning to pick up, swirling the early snowflakes into patterns that seemed almost intentional. They pushed through the wild roses, now bare and thorny, and ducked into the cave entrance just as the full fury of the storm hit. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, a roar of wind that seemed to shake the very rock around them. Snow drove horizontally past the cave entrance, so thick that the world beyond disappeared into white chaos. The temperature outside plummeted with terrifying speed, dropping 40 degrees in less than an hour. Inside the cave, in James's secret bedroom, the temperature held steady at 52 degrees. "We're going to be okay," Henry said, lighting the lantern and filling the space with warm, golden light. "We have food, water, shelter. The storm will pass." James nodded, but his eyes were on the entrance, watching the apocalypse unfold beyond their tiny sanctuary. "What about the cattle, Papa? What about the cabin?" "The cattle are in the ravine. They'll find shelter against the rocks. The cabin..." Henry paused. The cabin was sturdy, but the storm outside was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "The cabin will be there when this is over." "And if it's not?" Henry sat beside his son on the bed, pulling the boy close. "Then we'll build another one. Buildings can be replaced. You can't." The blizzard lasted 3 days. They spent those days in a strange, suspended state, cut off from the world, existing in a bubble of warmth and light, while death raged outside. Henry rationed their food carefully, unsure how long the storm would last. James read his book aloud to pass the time, the familiar words of adventure stories filling the cave with something other than the constant roar of wind. At night, they huddled together on the bed, sharing warmth even though the cave's temperature made it unnecessary. The closeness was about comfort, not survival. A father and son holding on to each other while the world tried to tear itself apart.
"Papa,"
James said on the second night,
"do you think Mama sent us this cave?"
Henry considered the question carefully. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he understood what his son was really asking. I think your mama would have wanted us to be safe. And we are safe. However that happened, whatever led me to find this place, we're safe because of it."
"I like to think she's watching, that she knows we're okay."
"I like to think that too." James was quiet for a moment.
"I'm glad you built me this room, Papa. Not just because of the storm. Because it gave me somewhere to be sad without you worrying about me. And that helped me stop being sad."
Henry felt tears prick his eyes. I was always going to worry about you. That's what fathers do.
I know, but this way I could feel sad by myself and then feel happy with you. I didn't have to pretend all the time. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
I love you, Papa.
I love you too, James. More than anything in the world. They fell asleep holding each other, the storm screaming outside, the cave holding them safe in its ancient embrace. The second day was the hardest. The wind seemed to intensify rather than diminish, and the howling took on a quality that felt almost personal, as if the storm was angry at being denied its victims. The snow had completely blocked the cave entrance by morning, and Henry had to dig a small tunnel just to see that the blizzard was still raging.
How long can it last?
James asked, his voice smaller than usual. Storms always end, Henry said, though he wasn't sure this one ever would. The longest blizzard I ever heard of lasted 4 days. We have supplies for a week. We'll be fine. They rationed their food more carefully. A few bites of dried meat for breakfast, a few pieces of hardtack for lunch, slightly more for dinner. Henry melted snow for water, carrying handfuls from the entrance tunnel and heating them over a candle flame. It was tedious work, but it kept him occupied and gave James something to help with. James spent hours looking at his mother's photograph, talking to her in whispers that Henry pretended not to hear. The boy told her about the storm, about the cave, about how scared he was and how brave he was trying to be. He told her about the books he had read and the dreams he had been having. He told her that he loved her and missed her and wished she could be there with them. Henry found these one-sided conversations unbearably moving. His son was processing fear and grief and love all at once, using the only tool available to him: connection with a mother who could no longer answer, but whose presence still mattered. On the third night, the wind finally began to die. The silence woke them on the morning of the fourth day. After 3 days of constant wind, the sudden quiet was almost more shocking than the noise had been. Henry lay still for a moment, listening, making sure it wasn't just a lull before another assault. But no, the storm was truly over. Pale light filtered through the cave entrance, brightened by the snow that had piled up outside. "Stay here," Henry told James. "Let me see what's out there." He pushed through the entrance, shoving aside the snow that had drifted against the wild roses, and emerged into a world transformed. The snow was everywhere, 5 feet deep in places, drifted to 10 or 15 feet where the wind had piled it against obstacles. The landscape was unrecognizable, familiar landmarks buried under white that sparkled in the weak winter sun. The temperature was still brutally cold, perhaps 20 below zero, but without the wind, it was survivable. Henry made his way down the ravine toward the cabin, his heart heavy with dread. The cattle were visible in the distance, dark shapes against the white. Some of them, at least. He would count the losses later. The cabin came into view as he crested the last rise, or rather, what remained of the cabin. The roof had collapsed under the weight of snow, the walls partially caved in. The structure that had been his home for 8 years, reduced to a pile of timber and frozen debris. Everything inside, furniture, clothes, tools, memories, was buried and ruined. Henry stood staring at the destruction, feeling the weight of everything he had lost. The ranch was crippled. The cabin was destroyed. Recovery would take months, maybe years, would cost money he didn't have. But his son was alive. He turned back toward the ravine, toward the cave where James waited, and felt something shift in his chest. The cabin could be rebuilt. The cattle could be replaced. The ranch could recover. James could not be replaced. James was irreplaceable. And James was safe, warm, alive. Because 3 months ago, Henry had decided to build a secret bedroom in a cave. The news from across the territory was devastating. The Great Blizzard of 1886 had killed hundreds of people and hundreds of thousands of cattle. Ranchers who had built empires over decades found themselves ruined in 3 days. Families who had survived years of frontier hardship succumbed to a storm that exceeded anything in living memory. Henry Dalton lost 40% of his cattle and the entirety of his cabin. By any objective measure, he should have been among the disaster's victims, another cautionary tale of frontier destruction. Instead, he became a symbol of something else entirely. Word spread about the rancher who had survived the blizzard in a cave bedroom he had built for his son. Neighbors came to see the cave for themselves, marveling at the warm space that had meant the difference between life and death. Newspaper reporters made the journey from Helena and Butte, writing stories that captured readers' imaginations across the country. "Father's love saves son from deadly storm," one headline read. "Secret cave bedroom becomes shelter from worst blizzard in history." The attention brought help that Henry hadn't expected. Donations came from readers moved by the story. Neighbors organized work parties to rebuild the cabin. A rancher from the next valley offered cattle at reduced prices to help rebuild the herd. The outpouring of support humbled Henry in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always been self-reliant, proud of his ability to handle problems without asking for help. But the community's response showed him that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was acknowledgement that humans needed each other, that survival on the frontier had always depended on neighbors helping neighbors. The cabin raising took place in March, once the worst of the winter had passed. 15 men showed up with tools and lumber, working from dawn to dusk for 3 days, until a new cabin stood where the old one had collapsed. It was larger than the original, better built, with a proper stone foundation and a roof designed to handle heavy snow loads. "This is too much," Henry protested as he watched the walls go up. "I can't repay all of this." "You're not supposed to repay it," one of the neighbors replied. "You're supposed to pay it forward. Next time someone needs help, you show up. That's how it works out here." The women of the community had been equally generous, contributing furniture, bedding, kitchen supplies, and preserved food to replace what had been lost. Catherine's friends, women who had known and loved her, brought items that they knew would have meaning. A quilt in the pattern Catherine had favored, dishes similar to the ones she had owned. Small touches that made the new cabin feel like a continuation rather than a replacement. "You built that cave for love," one of the neighbors said during the cabin raising. "And love saved you both. That's a story worth telling." Henry watched the new walls go up, watched his community come together to help him recover, and understood that the cave had given him more than physical shelter. It had given him a story that resonated with something deep in people's hearts. The story of a father's love for his son, expressed through labor and creativity, and the simple determination to give a grieving child something magical. James worked alongside the adults, hauling lumber and carrying nails, no longer the silent, grieving boy he had been a year ago. He told anyone who would listen about his secret bedroom, about the books he had read there, about the conversations he had with his mother's photograph. "Papa built it just for me," he said proudly. "And then it saved both of us." The cave bedroom remained in use for years after the blizzard. James continued visiting it throughout his childhood, using it as a reading room, a thinking space. a connection to the mother he had lost and the father who had given him a way to heal. When he eventually left for university, he sealed the entrance carefully, protecting the space that had meant so much to him. He returned as an adult, bringing his own children to see the cave where their grandfather had built something magical. The bedroom had deteriorated by then, the canvas ceiling torn, the wooden walls warped. But the space itself remained, the cool air still flowing, the rock walls still standing as they had for millennia. "Your great-grandmother died when Grandpa was a little boy," James told his children. "Great-grandpa Henry built this room so I could have somewhere to be sad and somewhere to remember her. And then it saved our lives when the biggest blizzard in history came." "Did you really live here during the storm?" his daughter asked. "For 3 days. We had food and water and blankets and each other. And we had warmth, because the earth stays warm even when the air gets cold." "Were you scared?" James considered the question, remembering those 3 days in the cave, the roar of wind, the closeness of his father, the strange peace that had settled over him despite the chaos outside. "I was scared at first," he admitted. "But then I realized that Papa had built this place to protect me. He had built it before he even knew about the storm. He had built it just because he loved me. And if he loved me that much, then I knew we would be okay." Henry Dalton died in 1912 at the age of 64, surrounded by a family that had grown from the broken pair who had huddled in a cave during the worst storm Montana had ever seen. His grave marker bore an inscription chosen by James. He built a room in a cave for his grieving son. That room became their shelter from the storm. Love always builds what love needs. The cave still exists today, protected now as part of a historical preservation effort that recognizes not just its significance during the blizzard, but its deeper meaning. The meaning of a father's love expressed through hammer and nail and countless hours of secret labor. Visitors who make the journey can still see the remains of the bedroom, can still feel the cool air that flows from the depths of the earth, can still stand in the space where a father and son survived the impossible because love had prepared a shelter before either of them knew it would be needed. The wild roses still grow at the entrance, descendants of the same bushes that hid the cave from casual observation more than a century ago. In summer, their fragrance fills the air with sweetness that visitors often comment on, a perfume that somehow feels appropriate for a place built on love and loss and the determination to create beauty from grief. Local historians have documented the cave's significance, collecting testimonies from James's descendants and preserving the newspaper accounts that made Henry Dalton briefly famous. The story appears in textbooks about the Great Blizzard of 1886, usually accompanied by a photograph of the cave entrance and an artist's rendering of what the bedroom might have looked like in its prime. But the historical details, important as they are, miss something essential about what happened in that cave. They miss the quiet conversations between a father and son during those 3 days of storm. They miss the tears and the prayers and the simple holding of hands that made survival bearable. They miss the healing that had already begun before the blizzard arrived, the magic that Henry had created by building something with his own hands for the child he loved. Sometimes the gifts we give to heal others end up saving us, too. Henry Dalton built a secret bedroom for his son, hoping to help a grieving boy find magic again. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined.